I think that segues nicely into Peter Attia's kind of central critique. I don't want to go over too many of the things that he said. I think there was one main critique that he had. He wrote this blog titled "A Study Comparing the Effects of Vegan and Omnivorous Diets Fails Science 101." Boy, did he come out swinging in this. He described the study as, and I quote, "categorical failure to isolate and test a specific independent variable, which, as emphasized in any sixth grade science class, is perhaps the most basic requirement for hypothesis testing." And he goes on to point out that the vegan group ate about 200 calories less per day and consumed significantly less saturated fat throughout the study, and says these differences could easily mean that the increased weight loss and greater reduction in LDL cholesterol relative to baseline among vegan participants were the results of lower intake of total calories and saturated fat, rather than to a vegan diet per se.
Yep, this is an, oh my God, Peter, what century are you living in? And this is particularly stunning given how much work Peter and I did on Diet Fits and low fat, low carb. So let's go back just for a minute. He helped me get millions of dollars to expand Diet Fits. NIH gave me $3 million and Peter helped me get $5 million. Make it the best study I ever did. Absolutely best scientific, most cited ever. And we did not isolate one variable in low fat and low carb. To eat low fat versus low carb, many things were different. You can't just have all the same food and have it be low fat and low carb. So let's go to vegan versus omnivore. So I'm sure you could probably get a sixth grader to say, oh, so what's different about a vegan and an omnivorous diet? Let's see. It has less beef and less chicken and less fish and less yogurt and fewer eggs. And it has less saturated fat and no cholesterol. And it has more fiber in the vegan diet. How would you make two diet patterns that were identical in everything except one thing? And what would that one thing be? So there were days in the last century when nutrition studies were shakes. You would put a bunch of things in a blender, you would blend it up. And now actually, you were talking before about blinding the participants. If it was a shake, you could blind them and you could drink mushed food that you couldn't tell what it was. And you could make as many things similar as possible and hold one thing constant.
But how generalizable is that to the listener or the everyday person that's just thinking, should I eat an omnivorous diet or should I eat a plant-based diet?
This is why it's so last century. Peter, what are you talking about? And this is kind of ironic that it's on the heels of me being the writing chair of the American Heart Association paper that compared DASH, Mediterranean, pescatarian, vegetarian, low-fat vegan, high-fat vegan, low-fat, low-carb, paleo, and keto. We have a whole beautiful table. It's super geeky, but I hope somebody will look it up.
And it's on screen right now.
Great. And we actually broke each one of those patterns into 4 categories. Particular foods that are emphasized, particular ones that it's okay to include, particular ones that you should focus on limiting, and particular things that you have to avoid if you're going to be on this one diet. And we went through every food group. And so all the patterns differed not in one component, but in all the components and not even one level. It wasn't a yes or no. It isn't emphasize or avoid. And a really important factor in many of these dietary patterns is there are things that you don't have to emphasize. You can include, and it's benign. We're not really sure which way to go. And there's another ones that you don't have to completely restrict, but you should limit them. We don't think you should have these. And, commonly these diet patterns get identified based on the thing that they emphasize or the thing that they avoid. So if it was vegan, you're avoiding all animal products. If you're keto, you're avoiding almost all the carbs. So as you go through this list, you couldn't possibly study any of those if you isolated it to a single variable. And this goes back to one of my initial comments in our talk today. So old school nutrition was very nutrient oriented, and the term we used is isolationist reductionist. And that was really important to understand some mechanisms. For example, is it the saturated fat or is it the cholesterol that raises the blood cholesterol? It's actually the saturated fat in your diet, not the cholesterol in your diet, that raises the blood cholesterol. That was 50 years ago. That was really important to figure out. So then we sort of moved to, oh, well then, is it the soy or is it the garlic or is it the whole fat dairy versus the low fat dairy? And that actually seemed more generalizable to move into the realm of foods that people would buy in a store. But then I was going to make fun of this. I'd find people say, yes, Professor Gardner, I'm doing the Mediterranean diet. Really? What'd you have today? Well, I had an Egg McMuffin for breakfast and I had a Big Mac for lunch and a Whopper for dinner. And by my nightstand, I have a little jigger of olive oil and I chug that before I go to bed. And I said, that's not Mediterranean. I thought olive oil was Mediterranean. No. It's olive oil on salads and on lentils and on whole grains. And so at that point, the community started moving more towards patterns as really being in this century and this decade more relevant to people's choices than Peter's view of isolating a single variable.
If you were to run this study as Peter kind of suggests that it should have been run, where you match calories, you match the composition of the diet, saturated fat, fiber, etc., what does that tell you versus the study that you ran? What's the difference in terms of the answers that you're getting?
Yeah, I wouldn't have answered the question that I wanted to answer. What happens if you go on a vegan diet? What if you eat fewer calories on a vegan diet just because it's vegan? Either it's more satiating or it's less palatable. You wish you had some other foods, but to be honest, that's part of some other strategies like intermittent fasting and how can you find a way to eat less calories. If I could go back to my tutorial for just a sec, I had a lot of fun writing the tutorial because I found in one of my other studies a ketogenic versus Mediterranean diet. It was the same design. For 4 weeks, we delivered the food, and for 8 weeks, they cooked on their own. And the keto group, even though they had the same number of calories delivered, ate 200 calories less per day than the Mediterranean group when we delivered the food. Virtually identical. No one came out of the woods to accuse me, hey, the keto folks lost a little more weight than the Mediterranean folks in your keto med diet study. Is that wrong? Did you intentionally feed them the wrong number of calories? And so it actually completely parallels this. I could have forced them to eat the same number of calories, but when they were eating keto, they ate less. Is that because it was more satiating or less palatable? I think so, some combination of that, or less familiar with it. So it's a different kind of question to isolate it like that. Can I take the saturated fat one thing further? Like, how would you make a vegan diet with a lot of saturated fat? You could add a lot of coconut.
Or palm oil, yeah.
But those chain lengths are shorter than the chain lengths in stearic acid, palmitic acid. And so then wouldn't I get a critic saying, why didn't you match the saturated fat level and the chain length of the specific fatty acids? I mean, it becomes absurd.
The point is you're really trying to get participants to eat as they would in real life if they were adopting a healthy omnivorous dietary pattern or a healthy plant-based dietary pattern. And part of that is that, like, when you shift to a healthy plant-based diet, naturally your intake of saturated fat, as long as you're not chugging down coconut or palm oil, typically goes down, and your intake of fiber typically goes up. That happens in the real world.
Yes.
Right? So what your study, the results that you're getting in that way are more applicable to that person who just shifts their dietary pattern. I'm trying to understand Peter Attia and where he's coming from, and Lane Norton had a similar critique. And so I think if we were to sit down with them, they would say, but it's possible to eat an omnivorous diet that is lower in saturated fat and is higher in fiber. It is possible. And I feel like there's a little bit of a double standard here because these both Peter and Lane often say, it's possible to eat an optimal amount of protein on a plant-based diet, but it's damn hard work. This is the exact same thing in reverse. It is certainly possible to eat very low or low saturated fat and get fiber up on an omnivorous diet, but relative to a plant-based whole food dietary pattern, it's going, in my view, I would argue, it's going to take more work and more planning.
Yes. It's this continuum of, do you want to be more on the side of efficacy or effectiveness? Where do you want to do this? And I honestly hope my epitaph on my gravestone says, and he was pretty damn good at studying generalizable diet patterns, which other people didn't study that way. That wasn't very pithy, but I really feel I take tremendous pride. I think the types of studies my group does is somewhat different than most other people because of that approach of matching everything or doing observational epidemiology. The kinds of studies I do are a bitch. They have multiple variables moving at one time. And so the fun I have, the reason I'm passionate about the science I do is it's a fun puzzle and challenge. How can you make two patterns that are different and define them in an intelligent way and assess them so that you can show how closely people did adhere? And one thing I'll own right here, anytime you want to ask, not everyone adhered to the same level. And to me, that is hugely important. That is part of the science, to show that even though you had a definition, even though you delivered foods, they didn't eat all the foods you delivered. Beyond that they didn't eat all the foods I delivered, those a-holes had the huevos to tell me they didn't. When we do the diet assessment, in our keto med paper, we have a really fun graphic to show that we were delivering the keto diet. On a scale of 0 to 10, 10 would be eating all the meals we gave them. Their adherence score was 2. It's like, really? I signed you up for the study. I'm delivering this food and you're not eating it? That's important to know, that there's different levels of adherence. Does that undermine the study? Does that mean you can't analyze the results? No, in my mind, those are some of the most important results to analyze.
And it probably makes it more generalizable. Like,
Yes.
You're not going to get perfect adherence in real life. So if you take a Kevin Hall metabolic ward study where you're essentially forcing people to eat all of the food, you see the results from that, but you don't know if that's going to translate into real life because of adherence.
And I cite his work all the time because I don't do the study that way. And that is a really important piece of the puzzle. I once did a conference presentation with David Ludwig, who did a really very impressive controlled study and published it in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, at the same time we did Diet Fits. And I think people in the audience missed the irony that in his study, and he was looking at people with insulin resistance on a low carb versus a low fat study. And he was looking sort of at energy expenditure with doubly labeled water. It was an elegant study. It was really beautiful. And his conclusion was kind of, well, this is going to help people in the real world. Turned out Diet Fits asked that question in the real world and it didn't work. A big part of Diet Fits was who was insulin resistant and who was insulin sensitive. And did that make a difference in weight loss? And that was the main I thought that was going to happen in that study. And it didn't. We didn't prove that hypothesis, but we were on the stage and he was saying, I have this elegant controlled study that shows that this could happen. And somehow he seemed to miss the point but we did that and it didn't. Those are two really important points and you can study them both, but they're different questions. They're importantly different.
Just quickly on that, I don't want to digress too much, but was there a reanalysis on Diet Fits?
He did
recently?
a reanalysis of Diet Fits.
And has that changed your views on that study
No.
and how to interpret it?
So actually, to be overly simplistic, early on, low carb did better. And at the end, they weren't different. And this is one of those things where I said this before in our conversation today. On clinicaltrials.gov, we said, I'm interested in the longest out point. I don't want the short-term interim. I want to see what happens after a year. And so we're going to analyze this focusing on the year. If you looked at some of the early time points, low carb group lost more fat and had some better metabolic outcomes. that there was more recidivism on later in the study than there was in low fat, so they ended up in the same place. To me, I'm interested in the longer term outcome. I actually did not want to be a co-author on that paper, even though it's my data.